There is so much going on in the world today that upsets us, that triggers us, maybe occasionally excites us, but certainly there seems to be very little we can be indifferent about. But what do? We get excited and we get triggered, and is there anything we really can do about everything that goes on around us? And more importantly, should we be doing anything about it all? Today I want to look at the Stoic philosophy of indifference and whether that really is telling us that we need to be completely uncaring and not reactive to whatever is going on around us. I mean, the modern definition of the word seems to be don't care about anything else, just care about whatever you, I suppose, care about, but be indifferent. When we call someone indifferent, it's meant as a kind of an insult or as a criticism of their behavior in some form. And the word indifferent is to us a heavily loaded word, but to the Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, it was one of the most important concepts and is easily misunderstood and misconstrued as meaning couldn't care. In Stoic philosophy, indifference is about being indifferent to external things, indifferent to wealth, indifferent to pain, indifferent to winning, indifferent to hopes and dreams. When I say things like indifferent to hopes and dreams, indifferent to winning, it also sounds loaded and problematical. So let's take a deeper dive into the Stoic philosophy of indifference, see why it's so important and why it really benefits us to understand the world that way. It's likely that the Stoics would even have something to say about our reaction, about even our getting a little bit upset about the possibility that indifference means something about our behavior being uncaring or even worrying about what the word means. The point about indifference was for us to be strong enough so that nothing is affecting us, triggering us, blowing us off our path. Obviously, it is better to be rich than poor. Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher, was possibly the richest man in Rome at the time. He was extraordinarily wealthy. And he's the one who said, obviously, it's better to be rich than poor, tall than short. But the point is that the Stoic is indifferent when fate has other plans, because the Stoic and the philosopher, the person following Stoic philosophy, is strong enough to make good of whatever there is. So it's not apathy, it's not a lack of expectation, it's really just the strength in not needing a preference, and it's the strength in dealing with whatever it is. You don't have to be in the perfect environment where everything's okay and where nothing's triggering you. The point of successful living, for nothing to trigger you, is that it doesn't matter what the triggers are, they don't trigger you. It's not that they're not there and we're living in a cleaned up world. So the Stoics categorize things as three types. There's good things, and those are things which benefit ourselves. And there's bad things. There's those things which don't benefit ourselves. Everything else, indifferent things. Indifferent could be good or bad, but is generally dependent on other things. While we don't really have control over all these things, the things that I'm calling triggers, what we do have to do every day, all the time, is essentially judge whether something is good, bad, or indifferent. And that process of adding the value judgment, good, bad, or indifferent, is the delicate balance that we have to face every day as a human being, but which, following that Stoic philosophy, is what gives us the ability to handle a world full of all sorts of triggers. I say it very often on this show, and that is that the ultimate bottom line of what the Stoics are trying to say is that we should only be concerned about the things that we are ourselves in control of, which are very few things and which mostly gravitate around ourselves. It doesn't mean lack of concern for things that are happening in the world or things that happen to other people. But I used the word triggering earlier on to suggest affecting our lives. To what extent must we allow things to affect our lives? Donald Robertson says, for Stoics, it's not about things being good or bad. Things outside of us don't make our souls better or worse, or affect our sense of fulfillment in life. That stuff, it comes from us. So Robertson says, what matters ultimately is the use we make of them, good or bad, virtuous or vicious. And so that's another key point about indifference. It recognizes the situation is not something that I'm in control of, but I have to decide, where do I stand in what I am able to do with that. So in situations where we do have to respond or react to something that technically we're not in control of, we have to ask ourselves the question, for me, can I make good use of that for my virtue as a human being, or bad or not at all? We encounter stimuli of every kind every day. We get the stimulation, we make an impression on it, we make a judgment of it based on our own morality and based on our own experience of some kind. And then we decide whether the experience is good or bad or true or false or worth it or not worth it, or whatever the case may be. The Stoics point out that mostly we're not really in a position to say that, because it's all subjective and about something we're not in control of. So we should really suspend our judgment and categorize it as indifferent. So there you can see that indifferent doesn't mean disinterested. It doesn't mean unimportant. It really is the way of coming to a balanced decision that says, I can't decide whether this is a good stimulus or a bad stimulus, and therefore I cannot act in a way that inevitably will get me freaked out or hung up or deeply involved in something that's not in my control. So indifference is about equanimity. It's about taking an equivalent attitude to everything that you're not in control of and suspending your judgment. We know great wisdom in the instruction, even the biblical instruction of not to judge. We should not judge. We are not the judge. We know, we can feel the essence of truth in that advice, but we also know that we actually make judgments all the time, for better and for worse, whether we should or shouldn't. It's embedded pretty much in everything that we do. Even making a choice or a decision requires us to make a judgment. So we can see that the Stoic instruction to be indifferent might also be expressed as a Stoic instruction to be fair, to be balanced in our choices and decisions. If we suspend our decisions and we allow something to be neither good nor bad, then we will treat it equally to anything else that we haven't made such a decision about. Remember, for our own stuff that is in our control, we do make choices about good or bad. We do make those moral choices. So again, it's not as if this is a careless removal from the world, but it's more about, since I'm not in control of it, and since I need to be indifferent to things that I'm not in control of because my thoughts or feelings or triggeredness about it makes no difference. That's why I need to be indifferent, because I can make no difference. And if I can make no difference, then the best approach is to be fair, balanced about it for my own sanity. It is also a kind of a moral choice, and maybe that's a slightly different story. But the point about philosophy and the point about Stoicism is that it is an effort to live a fair moral life and to be content in that, not to be pushed and pulled by how life actually works. And the Stoics are saying, well, because of how life actually works, it triggers us all the time. And because you can do nothing about that stuff, be indifferent to it, which forces you to treat it equally with everything else in your life. And that means it's not triggering so much. And Epictetus said, men are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take on things. By allowing ourselves to become upset by external things, we are making a judgment about those things. We're not being indifferent. But his statement is that it's not the thing that disturbs us. It is our own view that disturbs us, because the thing is a thing. It's outside of ourselves. It's often an abstract thing or a material thing. So it has no power to disturb us. It is our response to it that disturbs us. Even money it shouldn't disturb us. Lack of it or a large amount of it, it's our response to that or other people's money. Epictetus tells us that material things themselves are indifferent, but how we handle them is not indifferent. And that makes it challenging to maintain this constant tranquil mind and the constant careful spirit, because we tend to make hasty judgments or react to things as if they had an intention of their own. And so Epictetus then compares it with a game of chance. When we throw a dice or anything like that, whatever comes up is equal to whatever else comes up from the dice point of view, from the point of view of this mechanical object, the dice. It might have a different result in terms of who wins the game, who gets the money, or any of those kind of things. But the dice is just the random fall of things. And so he tells us we should imitate those who play dice and realize that every fall of the dice is the same as every other. We should be indifferent to it. The dice he's using as an example to prove to us that it's the random fall of events outside of our control. So if you get upset that you lose or that someone else wins, think about as you're blaming this little plastic or wooden object that is the dice for causing this bad luck or for causing you to lose the money, any of those kind of things. Logically, of course, it's not the dice. And so he uses that as an example of the dice is indifferent. So we should be indifferent. The dice, whether it lands on a 6 or whether it lands on a 1, from the dice point of view, it's exactly the same. So we should reflect the dice and realize even if that gives me money or gives someone else's money, this is a neutral situation that I have no control over. So there's no one to blame. There's no one to react to. What am I reacting to if I say, darn, I never got the money? So hence, it's the example of everything is essentially the same. How we respond to it is up to us. Another example that Epictetus does acknowledges that what I just said is easier said than done. He says, well, it's actually difficult to combine these qualities of being diligent to earn a living and make sure that you get your materiality with the indifference of whether or not I get it. He says, easier said than done. But he says, it's not impossible, because if it were impossible, it would also be impossible to be happy. So he says this, he says, we act very much like we're on a voyage. So if I go on a voyage, what can I do? I can choose the sailors, and I can choose the day, and I can choose the moment I go, and off we go. Then a storm comes. What do I care? I have fulfilled my task in terms of my path. Someone else now has to act, the sailor. Even if the ship goes down, he says, what have I to do? He says, the only thing that I have to do that lies in my power is to drown. If drown I must, without fear, not crying out, not accusing heaven. For I know that what is born must needs also perish. For I am not immortal, he says, but a man, a part of the universe. as an hour is part of the day. Like the hour, I must be here, and like the hour, I must pass away. So what matters it then to me how I pass? By drowning, or by fever, or by some such means, I must needs pass away. It's very, very powerful thought. It's a great image, but behind that lies a lot of wisdom and a lot of power. Not only about dealing with death and accepting death, but in using that as an example of indifference. If you're on a ship that's going down, it is pointless to cry out to fate or heaven. You did what you had to do. You booked the ticket for the ship. That was the only power you had. You had the power to choose which ship you were going to go on and where that goes to. But after that, there's nothing you can do. So anything that happens, you have to accept because you have no power to change it. And he uses the example of death as a great example to put in the idea that, of course, we have to be indifferent to our death because it's absolutely guaranteed and inevitable. So what's the difference if it's now or then, or if it's by this means or that means? Because it's going to happen. There's a lot of food for thought then. But he says, if that's the case, how is it that some external things are described as natural and some as unnatural? That's a really powerful question because we regard ourselves as detached from the universe. So because we think that it's all happening out there, we think that things are unnatural because we don't understand that we are part of this. This is a guy saying that 2,000 years ago. That is a complaint that we might associate with the modern sentiment of how we've distanced ourselves from nature. And 2,000 years ago, had they? Well, it's enough for Epictetus to say, we describe things as unnatural only because we have separated ourselves from nature. We don't actually understand what nature is. So he says, for the foot, for instance, I shall say it is natural to be clean. But if you take it as a foot and not as some detached thing, it will be fitting for it to walk in the mud and tread upon thorns and sometimes be cut off for the sake of the health of the body, or else it will cease to be a foot. He says we should hold exactly the same view of ourselves. If you regard a human being as a detached being, then it is natural for that person to live to old age, to be rich, to be healthy. But if you regard a human being as part of a larger whole, that is nature, that whole makes it fitting that at one moment you should fall ill, at another moment you should go on a voyage, at another you should be at your wit's end, and at another you might die before your time. That's how nature works. He says, then why are you so angry? Do you not know that just as the foot spoke of, if viewed apart, will cease to be a foot, so you will cease to be a human being? For what is a human being? A part of a city, a country, a community in which everything, people and our beliefs and our behaviors are incorporated. And secondly, that city is a small part of a much greater universe. With that perspective, again, remarkable from someone 2,000 years ago, then he says, if you understand yourself to be part of something, then it's not unnatural to die. Then it's not unnatural for bad things to happen. Because in the greater scheme of the world and of nature, everything is happening. All the good stuff and the bad stuff. There is nothing unnatural. If it happens in nature, it can't be supernatural or unnatural. It must be natural. That must be the behavior of nature. But he's also saying we only regard things as unnatural or supernatural because we're disconnected from nature. So who are we to say what's nature? And that's why we fear death, or when bad things happen, we think it's unfair. And we think that good stuff, we often say we deserve better. By what do we deserve that? Who should give us what we deserve. It's not about deserving. If we look at nature, there's no deserving. If you look outside of you, this beautiful environment here, you look at the trees, you look at everything else, what deserves anything? Nothing deserves that. We don't think of that when we look at nature. We don't think of nature as deserving anything. We think it's amazing, it's beautiful. When we see, in this kind of environment, when we see a kill, lions kill another animal, we don't think it's unfair for the buck that got killed. We might feel sorry for that buck that got killed, but we don't think it's unfair. But then we see ourselves as completely separate from that. So when the same happens to us, we think it's unnatural and unfair, and we rail against God and fate and all of that. Indifference is the effort to teach us that we need to be balanced in our response to everything because we are part of nature. And we understand that everything is as it should be, not because someone necessarily ordained that it should be. The ultimate destination of indifference is nature. Epictetus tells us the whole point of being indifferent is to live according to nature, we would say, to attune ourselves and tune in, that our separation from nature, our detachment from nature, causes not indifference, because that's not the kind of detachment he means, but it causes us to fail to recognize how nature works and to fail to recognize how we ourselves work. He says, as long as the consequences are unknown to me, I should hold fast to what nature ordains. Because God himself, says Epictetus, created me with the ability to choose what is natural. If I really knew that it was ordained for me now to be ill, I should wish to be ill. For the foot too, if it had a mind, it should choose to get muddy. So he says, for example, why do ears of corn grow? They grow to ripen in the sun. And if they ripen, is it not that they should be reaped? For they are not things separate from everything else. If they had feelings, then, should they pray never to be reaped at any time? He says that would be a curse upon corn. If we had to pray because of the poor, poor corn, that it should never be reaped, we are essentially cursing the cornfield in, of course, that old Roman way. In like manner, he says, know that you are cursing men when you pray for them not to die. It's like a prayer not to be ripened, not to be reaped. We men, he says, being creatures whose fate it is to be reaped, are also made aware of this very fact that we are destined for reaping, but we are angry because we don't know who we are. And so we bear what comes upon us, and we groan and we call it circumstances have affected me. Says Epictetus, what do you mean by circumstances? If you mean by circumstances everything that surrounds you, he says, well, everything that surrounds you is a circumstance. And then you should say hardship, not circumstance, if you're saying that it's the fault of what's around me. And how is it hardship that what is born should be destroyed? That's the way of nature. He says the instrument of destruction might be a sword or a wheel or a sea or a tyrant or a fever. What matters it to you? All roads are alike. There is only one thing to remember, Epictetus reminds us. Know the difference between what is yours and what is not yours. Never lay claim to what is not your own. And once you understand that, you understand yourself to be part of something bigger. We control our actions, our responses, and how we handle the adversities we face. But living a life of virtue starts with ourselves, not with external things. We have the ability to distinguish what is and what is not within our control, to live in accordance with our virtues, to properly examine and apply our value judgments to the situations we encounter. If we remember that, we have power over our future because we have aligned ourselves with nature. We have learned the difference between what out there is mine to control and what isn't. And if I understand that what out there is not mine to control, then the so-called terrible things that happen to me are also part of nature. And if I want to live with nature, I harmonize, I accept, I remain indifferent, I remain balanced, I accept that it is outside of my control and that it is therefore as it should be. I don't have to do anything about it. I only have to worry about myself and how do I react, and try react with equanimity and fairness and awareness that I am part of that. I'm not separate from that. Indifference isn't about being separated. We are indifferent because we are part of something bigger that has so much control over us. That is what indifference is. Indifference ultimately is a powerful form of attunement to nature and the recognition that there is something greater than ourselves.